Hi, bonsoir tout le monde. Merci pour votre présence aujourd'hui ici à Casa del Popolo. Et c'est un plaisir pour rejoindre cette panel de discussion sur le potentiel d'un gouvernement conservateur au Canada et toutes les violences sociales qui passaient dans ce contexte dans le passé. Et pour adresser ça avec les voix de les gens qui engageaient toujours dans les communautés qui luttaient pour la justice dans beaucoup de contextes. I'll just say hi, thanks for being here. We thought it was important to try to have a conversation that looks honestly at what a potential conservative government would look like for people who are doing frontline community work on a daily basis, people who in the past have dealt with conservative governments and all the violence that comes with that. So it's a pleasure that we can gather this conversation. Moi aussi, juste mentionner, cette panel, c'est pas organisé dans un contexte pour dire cette contexte aujourd'hui, c'est un miracle ou c'est une situation sans violence avec un gouvernement libéral MPD. Non, pas du tout. Toutes les organisations, les militants qui représentent les choses aujourd'hui, c'est lutter toujours. So it's also important that we say that the people who are present today are, from struggles that are ongoing. And, we're obviously not under any illusion that these struggles continue under a liberal NDP government. But we thought it was very important to talk honestly and to start a conversation before the election and to hear these perspectives. And we're very lucky that we'll be able to hear these perspectives today. So thank you for coming, and thanks to Casa del Popolo for hosting us. So we'll just get right into it, and I'm just going to share a series of questions with the panelists today for you to share your reflections with the audience. Thank you to CKUT Radio also, who's recording this. So I think the first question is, if you could just introduce yourself and speak a bit about the work that you do. You can mention an organization if that's important to you, or a community association, and share a bit about, why centering these experiences that Drew just mentioned, the experiences of communities who would be very deeply affected by a conservative government, is important when we think about opposition to the Conservatives. And I say that because, in the past when Conservatives have come to power, there's this idea that, it was great before the Conservatives came to power. But, we know that these issues extend across governments, but are particularly violent in the Conservative context. So thank you again all for being here. I know you're very involved in many things. So I'll just pass the mic across this panel, and if you could just introduce yourself and address that first question, that would be wonderful. And I'll be passing CKUT's microphone, and they'll be registering what you're saying. So I'd say, first of all, also please welcome the panelists, because they all made an effort to be here. So please put your hands together.
You want me to start?
Yes, I'll just start.
Okay, my name is Ehab Lotayef. I have been active over the last 35 years since I came to Canada in different groups, different causes, against the blockade of Gaza, against the sanctions on Iraq, against Law 21 locally. I've been a member of groups and on the board of groups like the Canadian Arab Federation, the Parole Arabe in Montreal, No à la Loi 21, the Freedom Flotilla. I guess that's enough to give a picture of what I was involved in, and I guess all those kind of causes are gravely affected. And I will repeat what Stefan said. What we're talking about here does not mean that in any way that there is satisfaction among a big sector of the Canadian population about what the Liberal government is currently doing with the NDP support. Finally, just yesterday, the Muslim community woke up with things that have been asked. Some people have been saying for 30 years, don't give the Prime Minister, whoever he is, a photo op because he's the one who benefits from the photo op and he gives nothing back to the community. So finally, yesterday, a group of Muslim leaders have canceled the meeting with Trudeau and led that to cancel the whole meeting. And that's really grassroots power. Again, I think it's very late, but I'm still very happy, very satisfied that they took that position. I have grave concerns about the Conservative governments, notwithstanding what I said about the Liberals, but grave concerns because first, the Conservatives, most right-leaning or right-wing governments and groups do something that the so-called progressives or left-leaning or left of center don't do. They go right away into implementing what they want to do. They don't wait. They don't try to appease public opinion. We've seen, for example, the CAC, within a few months of being in government, they passed Bill 21. They're passing bills just like that. They don't try to lobby the population or try to look good. And this is a very dangerous issue because to undo these damages that are done takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And it probably takes twice or three times the time period that there is a right-wing government to undo the damage that they do. And this is a huge fear. Other fears that I have witnessed myself is cutting funding and cutting programs that are related to any organization or group or NGO that is affiliated with minorities or affiliated with progressive causes. On my watch, the Canadian Arab Federation got all its programs cut by the Harper government. Till today, it became a very weak shadow of what it was one day, and that was a major act. The same happened here in Montreal with Alternative, for example. These kind of effects have very long-term effect and take a lot of wind from the sail of those who want to make this society more equitable, more fair, more just, fight for minorities, fight for science. I mean, that's another thing. Under Stephen Harper, we saw how government scientists were stifled. They couldn't say what they wanted to say. Every bureaucrat becomes like in danger of losing their job if they speak out, even on scientific or studied economical theory basis about what the government is doing. And this also creates a huge shift within the community. And unfortunately, when a part of the community, a part of the leaders of the community, a part of the political leaders move to the right, it causes a lot of sections in society and in the political scene to move to the right with it. The challenge becomes that they start competing on the same votes, on the same base, which damages us all extensively. And so I guess we would like to have more of a conversation, so I will stop here. We still have to hear from all the respected colleagues and community workers and leaders on this panel, and hopefully we'll have a very fruitful discussion and we'll manage to create something like what Drew spoke about, which is really to get closer to each other, to know how we're going to act. I don't want to say when, but it looks like when more than if we have a conservative government in this country. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't put this on the floor.
Stefan, do you want to pass it all the way down first?
Yes. Yeah, you're next.
I'm next? Okay. My name is Dolores Chu, and I was born and raised in India and arrived here in Jajaga many decades ago. I arrived completely politically unaware, not even realizing that I was a settler on unceded lands. And one of the things that has happened over the decades that I've been here is gradual political involvement and engagement, starting from the community identified with people of South Asian origin, but working with so many other communities and just learning so much. And I think that's so important, and what Drew and Stefan have done today is bringing some of the communities together, because in our organizing we learn from one another and strength. So I'm one of the founding members of the South Asian Women's Community Center in Montreal. We've been here now for over 4 decades. But I'm also involved to some extent in diasporic politics related to South Asia and increasingly combating Hindutva fascism, which is unfortunately alive and well, just as we experienced last Thursday, where they tried to shut down our event in a very violent way, calling us terrorists. And again, as Ehab said, there's a general lack of information and awareness, and governments are not concerned, even though we have been alerting them to such things till maybe a man is assassinated. The other thing that I want to say in terms of a little bit about who I am, etc., one of my other hats is as an educator. I teach in a college, and I am honored and privileged every semester to meet, over 100 young people, many of whom are very open and very eager to learn. And even though perhaps I'm well past retirement age, I sort of feel this need to be there and help in this process. Today you asked us to talk about actions we're engaged with. There are so many things, and of course, for many of us, Palestinian rights, and we make the connection between colonialism. So I'm the product of a colonial society, but I've come to a place where colonialism is also alive and well, unfortunately. And we have many people, so I'm not going to keep talking. I'll pass it on.
Hi, I'm Sandra Wesley. I'm the executive director of Stella Montréal. We're an organization by and for sex workers located here in Montreal since 1995, celebrating 30 years next year, which is amazing, right? Thank you. So it's really wild that a sex workers' rights organization fully by and for is still running 30 years later, but it also means that we actually haven't accomplished what we set out to do in 1995, which was to get rights. So in terms of the context of the fear of this new conservative government coming in, for us, we're living already in the nightmare. So we won at the Supreme Court in 2013. It was a unanimous decision where the Supreme Court said that the laws were unconstitutional because they literally were killing us, were jeopardizing our safety, our health, and therefore could no longer exist. It was a conservative government at the time, so instead of listening to the Supreme Court, they used it as an opportunity to fully criminalize sex work for the first time in Canadian history, make laws that are a lot worse than previous laws. And so in 2015, when Liberals were elected, they were against this law when it passed. Just a year before, we expected that maybe there's a chance they would do something, but they didn't. Instead, for the past, almost 9 years now, they've been keeping us busy. They've been making us do a lot of work. We're back in court, and the Liberal government is fiercely defending these laws in front of the court, saying that we deserve to die if we commit crimes, going really willing to make legal arguments that are jeopardizing Morgentaler in the pursuit of saying we don't have autonomy over our body that lets us do sex work. So we're already in this dystopian nightmare with a Liberal government. And so the fear of this getting worse, it's even hard sometimes for us to imagine. But we see what's really clear is that there's a pattern that's already in action of even people that call themselves progressives, people who claim to support us, that are already preparing for this. And it's now the new excuse to not do anything. Well, the Conservatives are coming in a year, so let's not even try. Let's not even do anything. And I think that we should have a different approach to that and actually fight harder than ever and demand more from progressives than ever. And just to finish my little intro, I'm also the chair of TOMS, which is the Montreal Network of HIV Organizations, which is also a very vibrant sector of activism. Communities affected by HIV are affected because governments hate us. And that's why this epidemic is continuing. That's the central element. And so we're very aware of this hatred. And it doesn't take that much hatred to put people in danger. So a little bit of hatred is already killing us. And so this extreme level of hatred that's coming will probably roll back a lot of the progress that we've made in HIV.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. It's a very privilege and it's very important for the organization. Sorry, I'm starting to talk about before I introduce myself. My name is Anaïs Montenegro. I'm from Costa Rica. I'm in Canada since 4 decades ago. I've been involved in community since the latest 90s when I started my transition in Quebec, Montreal, actually. I actually start with ASTT, which is the organization I come to represent for this table tonight, this evening. I've been part of the organization since the beginning. The organization was founded by for trans people because of the HIV that time back in the 80s and in the 80s, 90s. So we decided to get together and create an organization that can fight for our rights. And here I am representing that organization. We are part of 6 projects that are in Cactus Montreal. We are part of that organization that is harm reduction. So we have a different context of harm reduction. That's why I'm very pleased to talk about today because I'm an outreach worker at ASTT since before the pandemic, even though I've been a member at ASTT since the beginning of the project. I've been involved in many different marginal events and marginal phases that as an immigrant, as a trans migrant, I represent that population that is very affected by the new laws if we decide to create more obstacles for the new arrivals to become a part of our society. So as a outreach worker, I am very pleased to be here because everything that we just heard concerns us. Everything. People from outside of Canada, people that work. Actually, our organization is basically funded for trans sex workers. So I was also a trans worker before, and I'm very proud to be part of this organization as a Cactus and the project Aztec that allows to have access to people who are coming here without any knowledge of how to navigate through the system. So we help them a lot. And as you can tell my accent, so I speak French. I'm gonna keep talking in French. I wanted to do my introduction in English, but I'm better off in English and French. Sorry. So that's about a little bit about Aztec, Association Santé, Travesti, Transexuel du Québec. So we are open since 1998. So I pass my micro to. Mhm.
Hi, my name is Nakuset. I'm originally from Lac La Ronge, Saskatchewan, Treaty 6. I was adopted through the 60 Scoop, so I've been living in Montreal since I'm 3. I have been working at the Native Women's Shelter since 1999, and through the years, I've been able to create different projects, Cabot Square Project, the Ishkwe Project, the Welcoming Fire Outreach Project. We just opened Mioskamin, which is the second stage housing for Indigenous women and children, and of course Resilience Montreal. So my experience, since I've been working at the shelter for a long time, is that when Harper came in, we got our funding cut from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And this was money that was for residential school survivors and those that are generationally impacted, like myself. And we only had the money for like 2 years. And it was a shock because it's like, what do you mean? Like residential schools have been around for over 100 years, and you give us 2 years to heal. So that was shocking because then I had to find additional funds so that I could keep all the programming that we used to have. So what happens is that, you know, the community that relies on these services don't have them anymore, and then they're disappointed and they don't know where to go. So I had to work extra hard to, you know, recreate these programs, finding different monies. And now that, you know, this potential news about a new conservative government coming in, when I talk to my colleagues from different Indigenous colleagues from different organizations, everyone is already like freaking out. We received, the Native Women's Shelter received monies and actually started resilience from Nietzsche, which is a new organization by Indigenous for Indigenous. And they are actually waiting for billions of dollars from the government. Like they give them like a little snippet of money and the big money is coming, and now they're like, well, will we see it if the conservatives come in? So I think that almost every conversation I have now with different Indigenous leaders is, oh, you're planning on doing that in a year? How is that going to work out if we have the conservative government? So now we're sort of already thinking about plan Bs, because we have to keep moving forward. And I think there's been a lot of momentum in the Indigenous community. There's been a lot more organizations. There's like across Canada, like we're really, you know, finding our footing and you know, going forward. And I'm not interested in stopping in any way. So it's of great concern. That's all I got. Sorry.
I'll grab the microphone. Sorry. No, it's good, Dolores. It's fine. Yeah, we'll go there. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have a lot of great speakers today, so it's going to take a moment to pass the microphone. But I think it illustrates how profoundly important it is that we start this conversation. I mean, when we were thinking about this panel, I sort of started making a list of different organizations and activists locally that would be good to have as speakers. And I also spoke with some friends and people I organized with. And I think the list I had was like 26 people. And, you know, we just invited a handful. But I think it illustrates one point, which I wanted to ask you all about, which is, you know, we can talk about, you know, your analysis of the political conditions we're facing, which I really appreciate. But also you all have a lot of experience. So one thing that's coming forth, it seems, in some of the commentaries is how do we build alliances? How do we build common connection between different organizations, between different struggles? And I'm sure that you all have some sort of experiences around, you know, positive experiences of coalition building. Building coalitions is really hard. You know, I think a lot of people here know that. But it's very important, obviously. And you know, I think we agree on principle that it's important, but it's also good to hear about people's experiences of successfully building coalitions to work together, you know, to make sure that we have our power articulated. Because I think that that's really one of the questions is there's clearly going to be an effort to divide and conquer, to cut funding, to attack different communities, to scapegoat different communities. So I'd love to hear your ideas about coalition building, why it's important, and any stories you'd like to share from your own organizing experience, because you all have a lot of rich organizing experience. So thank you so much.
Anybody who wants to.
Well, it's, yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Stefan. I was trying to stay very much on script, so I'm ready for this next point. So definitely, I mean, there's so many issues with the Liberal government for sure, but the idea of like those Harper years of like 8 years of horror are still pretty much with us. And I'll just give you a few examples. So one of the things that, I mean, 9/11 had happened before Harper came to power, but there was growing Islamophobia, and Harpo is like Islamophobic on steroids, right? And we started hearing things like the rise of honor killings and forced marriage and barbaric cultural practices. And we were really appalled because, I mean, not to diminish the issue of interpersonal violence and that the majority of people who are attacked in interpersonal violence are women. And in our work in the South Asian Women's Community Center, we see this, right? But what we objected to was the racializing and the sort of then the implicit assumption that this is what brown people do. They commit honor crimes, right? And it just created this hysteria. And similarly with the forced rhetoric about forced marriage. And yes, a lot of people in our community still use the practice of the arranged marriage, but it's not necessarily always coercion. And so we started working in our communities and also with other women's groups and putting out information. What is this honor crime? So if a brown woman is attacked, then the media will talk about honor crimes. But if it's somebody who's not racialized in some way, it's just this happened. It's very dangerous. And similarly with the issue of forced marriage. Chris Alexander, towards the end of the Harper regime, was the Minister of Immigration, Refugees, etc. And he sort of went on this bandwagon. And if the Conservatives hadn't been thrown out, he probably would have succeeded in introducing legislation, what he calls zero tolerance for barbaric cultural practices. And again, these are euphemisms that target and construct non-white people in a very, very racialized way. So he invited a bunch of us, invited us at SAWCC, not knowing who we were, to a breakfast to talk about his campaign of zero barbaric practices, zero tolerance for barbaric practices. And we went to speak to him about a woman who was going to be deported to Egypt, right, who was in fear of her life. And we sort of, like, he was going around the table and, he thought we'd all behave very nicely and politely. And we said, well, wait a minute, like, you're talking about barbaric cultural practices, not that we buy into it, but you're ostensibly sending a woman back who has come here claiming gender violence. So what is that, right? So just very quickly trying to point out, the racialization and double standards. And now we're seeing with the situation in Palestine, how this Islamophobia has really, really snowballed to a point that Palestinians are completely dehumanized, right? The Liberal government has appointed Ms. Lyons and then Anthony Housefather. So you would think, and not to diminish the presence of anti-Semitism, right? But you would think that this was the greatest form of racism. And so, governments and politicians use their power and hegemony to put forward agendas. One last thing that I want to mention, there are so many horrible memories about the Conservatives in power at that time. When Idle No More happened at the end of 2012, and we had Cree youth marching in the cold winter from northern Quebec to Ottawa, and Teresa Spence was there on hunger strike because of the situation at Attawapiskat. Harper went to Toronto to greet two pandas that had been sent by China to the Toronto Zoo, and he was not in Ottawa to meet these young people. So, there was no pretense even of the absolute, lack of respect. So I think I'm just going to pass it on now.
Thank you. Okay, so I think the example that I want to talk about is just to illustrate the amount of work that needs to be done. And especially when there's a sense of urgency, there's a temptation sometimes to just really want to organize as fast as possible. But when we have governments that don't care about our collective voices and are happy to just cherry pick individuals as experts and try to break us up, well, it's the moment where it's important to have collective discourse that is coherent and that everyone can use and understand. So for sex workers in Canada, when we we're faced with these new laws. Obviously, the first thing that we have to do is just educate everyone on, when are we going to get arrested and for what, and, those basic things. But once that first emergency was done, we got together with all of the groups from the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, which is about 25 groups across Canada, primarily by and for sex workers. And we came to the conclusion that for decades we were screaming decriminalization everywhere, but we hadn't actually articulated what does that mean? What's the bill that we need passed at this stage? So we took about 18 months where we consulted all the groups across Canada. We did several meetings with a smaller committee of representatives from different groups to educate ourselves on what is possible within the law, how does the Constitution work, how do certain other types of provincial law work, all of those topics that we had identified that we needed to know in order to articulate law reform. And then from there, we were able to start elaborating the values that are required for law reform that respects sex workers' rights, and then go over every section of the criminal code one by one and make a decision about all of them. So the conclusion was somewhat similar to what we had always been saying: decriminalization, remove sex work from the criminal code. But now we have about an 80-page document that details exactly what that is, that gives us guidelines of this is okay, this is not okay. That goes over, once we remove it from the criminal code, where does it go in the provincial jurisdictions? What does it mean for labor rights? What does it mean for occupational health and safety? What are all the ways that once we remove police, that other forms of institutions can come and ruin our lives in different ways? So we were able to do all of this very slowly, very carefully. It did raise some disagreements in our community. We had a huge, several-month-long debate over all the groups about certain positions that for some of us were super obvious and other groups had not really thought about in the same way. We were able to also resolve within our movement some issues such as some general anti-Asian sentiment within sex worker groups, because it's really easy for a lot of sex workers to say, oh yeah, those Asian women, they must all be trafficked, send the cops after them, not me. And so we were able to actually take that head on and address it and look at all of the other segments of our community and then make sure that we have demands that meet everyone's needs. And so then we published this document, and since then we've been using this. So every time there's a call to testify in front of a committee, every time there's a brief that can be written, we have this document that becomes the way that we can speak collectively. So when they say, oh, we don't want to hear from you as a group, I'm going to call some random academic, we can tell that academic, well, that's the document. That's what you need to say, and that's it. And so I think that we need that type of work. In our case, we were so lucky that we had funding from Open Societies Foundations to do this at the time that they still cared about Canada and sex workers. They have now pulled out of all sex worker funding all over the world because they think we're a lost cause. But it cost us about $100,000 to do this over about 18 months. And that's why our movement is strong and can keep going. And so obviously it's not realistic to do that with every question, but that methodology of accountability, of actually educating ourselves really thoroughly, of identifying who in our community has that knowledge and can share it with others, making it accessible, that's how we can have sustainable movements. So I just wanted to give that example to just remind us that we can't just forget about that in the rush to respond to something really bad, that we need people organizing a protest, and we need people reading legal documents very carefully and producing workshops and training everyone so that we can have that collective message.
Oui, on a essayé de créer des partenariats avec plusieurs. Justement, on en fait partie de l'Alliance canadienne des travailleuses du sexe au niveau du pays. Et nous avons aussi d'autres partenariats avec des organismes qui luttent pour les droits des personnes migrantes, marginales. Et nous avons créé un lien avec un groupe qui s'appelle Agir, qui travaille beaucoup avec les personnes migrantes et de la communauté LGBTQ+. Et puis, on a Stella comme partenaire. Moi, personnellement, je suis aussi dans le conseil d'administration de Stella. On est très militante vis-à-vis de tous les droits de tout ça, parce que notre drapeau couvre beaucoup des enjeux, pas seulement les enjeux vis-à-vis la population, je pourrais dire, blanche, aussi comme la population autre que la population, je ne sais pas si on peut faire le lien des personnes marginales à... Attendez, je me suis en train de perdre un peu. Mais sinon, moi, personnellement, je me suis toujours prêté, et c'est pour moi très important de participer à tout ce qui représente la lutte, les combats contre l'impact que nous avons pour la violence chez les personnes trans. Donc, la violence que je vois parmi mes participantes, c'est aussi l'harcèlement, c'est la violence verbale surtout. Alors, on cherche à avoir des espaces de sécurité, on cherche à avoir les soins. Parce qu'en ayant la population migrante, quand ils arrivent, ils font la demande auprès du gouvernement fédéral. C'est le fédéral qui couvre leurs frais de soins santé. Donc, pendant la pandémie, les soins santé a été une des premières enjeux d'ASTT vis-à-vis la demande. Alors, on a eu beaucoup de demandes et l'offre n'était pas si forte pour pouvoir envoyer référer nos participantes pour les soins santé. Donc, les soins santé, l'espace sécuritaire, l'habitation, les logements. Moi, personnellement, j'accompagne beaucoup les gens qui moi-même, c'est très personnel puisque j'étais au début de la pandémie en éviction de mon appartement. Je me suis battu et j'accompagne mes participants que les propriétaires pensent que parce qu'ils viennent d'arriver, ils ne connaissent pas la loi, qu'ils vont se faire mettre dehors, et se faire discriminer sans aucun support et appui. Alors, grâce à notre appui, ils se parlent, c'est des bouche-oreilles souvent quand ils viennent nous voir. Et on est très content toujours de les appuyer par rapport à l'immigration. Comme je dis, c'est très fort, un enjeu très fort à STEC pour la réduction des méfaits, pour tout ce que je vous dis, les accompagnements. Alors, la lutte qu'ASTEC envoie aussi, c'est par rapport au travail du sexe, parce que nous sommes là aussi pour les travailleuses du sexe trans, et nous savons que les personnes trans sont beaucoup pénalisées, puisque si une personne qui est ici à titre de demandeur d'asile, puis il ou elle est trouvé à faire le travail du sexe, ils sont automatiquement exclus de pouvoir se procurer une résidence au pays. Donc, on essaie d'accompagner et de faire en sorte que ces gens sont défendus, qu'on fait la défense de tous ces droits. Donc, voilà, j'essaie de penser parmi tous mes accompagnements, tout ce que je touche, l'emploi. L'emploi aussi, on est très portant à aider ces mondes qui nous demandent par la discrimination à l'emploi, et les accompagner vis-à-vis les droits de leur nombre de travail, tout ça. Donc voilà, ça c'est un peu ce qu'on fait pour la lutte contre qu'est-ce qui arrive présentement avec le gouvernement que nous avons. Ben, c'est sûr que vis-à-vis le gouvernement provincial, ça c'est notre côté, mais le fédéral, on a la peur qui vient nous couper aussi de subventions ou n'importe quoi qu'on puisse avoir à cause qu'on sait très bien que si le gouvernement conservateur prend la relève, ça va être l'économie qui vont prendre comme drapeau pour défendre les coûts quand on coupe le mot quand on coupe c'est quand on coupe oui, non, l'austérité. On risque à l'austérité vis-à-vis la population trans. Donc, c'est ça. Merci.
I will briefly revisit the point of cooperation and coordination, and I think we are seeing right now something of that happening very strongly, thankfully due to the atrocities and the genocide that's happening in Gaza. Most, if not all, organizations, groups, no matter what their causes are standing together in support of the Palestinian rights at this point. I believe that this has to go both ways. I think that it's long overdue that this goes both ways on all causes. Unfortunately, we do see some schisms happening here and there because those in power manage to still instill some sort of divide and conquer attitude among activist groups. So if you get into other issues that we don't like, it's going to affect our dealing with you as well. And I think this is extremely dangerous, and this happens on all levels, and we should all be very aware about it. That today, whatever group, whatever cause I am defending, I should not isolate. On the contrary, I should connect myself to all other causes that I see as just causes. And I think that what's happening right now with the Palestinian issue is an example that should happen all across the board. And we don't need to see such atrocities, or it doesn't have to reach that situation that all groups acknowledge the rights that other groups are defending. It took such a long time for many groups to start acknowledging Native rights and the Native struggle and the residential schools. It took such a long time to acknowledge LGBT rights and LGBT problems. It took such a long time to be active and positive about what's happening in Palestine. We are still, as a society, we are still divided on something like Bill 21, for example, and the right of people in general to practice their religion. And it's not a religious point of view, it's a human rights point of view. We should all be not fall into the issues that they try to divide us by on those things. On the contrary, we should see that there is strength in us defending each other's cause, because that way we corner them more and make their job in ignoring us, in ignoring any particular cause, much more difficult than if every group just puts itself in a niche and just talks about that small niche. And that's a very important, I think, step forward towards cooperation, coordination, and being able to stand together. And there will always be differences. I'm a practical person. There is always going to be differences. But prioritizing and looking at where we can cooperate and putting aside the differences towards the greater good is extremely important, difficult, but it needs to be worked at inside every group and every organization.
So I think we're a group today here on the terrace, both the speakers and the audience, and I think it's not a stretch to say that most people here have been talking to their friends and their families in various ways about the threat of a conservative government, whether it's just being so irritated and pissed off by how clearly the conservative leader is manipulating people, particularly around housing. He's using a lot of discourse to sort of play politics in a way that is, I mean, at least to me, it feels like just so transparently odious. But a lot of people are talking about this, and that's exactly why we thought it was important that we have an actual conversation about what we could do about this, right? Like in the sense that we can see it happening in real time, that a lot of people are being manipulated by the Conservative government. And so one of the key things around dealing with the situation is organizing, right? And so you all have a lot of organizing skills in your respective spaces, right? And so if you could just talk little bit about the frontline organizing that you do, and some of the sort of like the issues that you're involved in, the work that you do, and how you feel those sort of skills or any sort of experiences that you have had or are having now should be applied to trying to build a coalition to address this Conservative situation, right? Because we're all sort of in this, we don't know exactly how we should be addressing this, you know, potential Conservative government, but we know the profound violence that would come if they are elected. And we're also aware that it's a continuation and connection to what's happening now. But it's like it's like a really shitty song, and the volume's going to get so loud it's going to become torturous. So, I mean, I'll just pass the microphone there. Oh, great!
Yeah, why
There
not?
we go.
Yeah, put her on the spot.
Sorry, what was the question? About organizing?
Well, and just like as you said, so many people are already talking about this.
Well, in terms of organizing, I mean, for the Indigenous community, when something really terrible happens, I have a tendency to organize, like when Joyce Echaquan died, right? And then it was COVID, and you weren't allowed to like march or be outside, and like I'm sure it's going to get arrested, but we had like 5,000 people that showed up because I think everyone could relate in some way to, you know, the abuse and what happened to her. And I think that is something that can be done, and that's what we do. But I get concerned sometimes about, like, every year we have the Every Child Matters, and the first time we did it was on July 1st, and we had like 10,000 people, and then after that we had 5, and then last year we had 2. Like, what, you don't care anymore about residential school? I think that should this new government come in, this whole reconciliation file, which is like a joke because no one's actually doing anything. The government, the institutions, they're not actually applying it. It's going to be completely removed. Like, the Conservative government is not going to find it to be important, but it is important. Those survivors that show up every year are like, what is going on? How come there's only a small crowd? Like, these stories, like the last residential school closed in 1996. So I guess my thing is, how do you keep the issue alive? We know about the mass graves, and it was unbelievable when that first story came out in Kamloops, and then in Saskatchewan, and now nobody cares. Now they have smaller ones and they show up and it's not even newsworthy. So although I'm good at organizing and I'm good at creating organizations and I'm not exactly sure how we're going to come to figure out what is the next step. I guess a tragedy has to happen, because within the Indigenous community, you have to understand, like, the government, like, we're on Crown land, right? Like, those that are on reserve still have to answer to the government, and they are dependent on the little payouts that they give. Like, I know that as a Native women's shelter in the city, when I talk to the shelters that are on reserve, they don't get very much funding, and they have to jump through all kinds of hoops, and they can't even get, like, different, like, private foundation funding. They're not allowed to receive that money. So being off reserve and I'm able to pull in all those monies, right? So I think that as a collective, we all are fighting the government in different ways. And when you talked about, like, Bill 96, you said Bill 21, Bill 96. Anyways, even that is, huh?
They're all evil.
But, like, it's just like Picard is like, okay, so if you're off reserve or, it doesn't apply to you unless you've lived on your community for 1 year or X amount of years. And I'm like, wait a minute. I'm from Lac La Ronge, never lived there. My kids are Indigenous, they never lived there. So we are not, like, they're fighting for those that are on reserve and not off reserve. So that is my concern with the Conservative government. How do we, as Indigenous people, both off reserve, on reserve, come together and fight this? Because that's a conversation that's going to be coming up pretty soon. And, the AFN was here, right? And I was like, oh, I want to go see the AFN. And it was like $850 to get in. I was like, what? So anyways, I sneaked in, and when Pierre was there, like part of the chiefs like turned their back on him, but some still gave him a blanket. I'm like, I don't know, I don't get it, I don't understand.
Pierre Poilievre.
Yes, yes. Apparently they didn't let Valerie Plante in though. She came and they did not let her on the stage, but Pierre was able to get on the stage. So I don't know what's going on there. There's a lot of internal politics that I'm not even aware of. So how are we going to come together? Because again, our struggle with the government is different because we're still waiting for, like me, I get $5 a year for being an Indian. That's from 1865. They never did the inflation. That's supposed to be another thing. Like, we're fighting on so many different levels. Cows and plows. Have you heard about that? Well, because I'm from Treaty 6. When the government did a treaty with my band, they promised to give every community member a scythe, a hammer, a plow, a cow, and they didn't do it. And then we basically starved to death. So now my community has sued the government, and there's some kind of settlement of $110 million. A lot of different communities are doing this. Like the Dene community just got their payout. If we get that Conservative government, we can kiss that goodbye. It is of concern, but because we're all so varied, we have to try to find some kind of commonality, and that's going to be the challenge, and that's all I've got to say about that. Thank you for listening.
Regarding organizing for trans people, ASTT has been part of the Trans March since almost the beginning. I wasn't there when Harper was in the government, and we got a deadline with a grant that we got for a couple of years, and it was finished by 2023, I believe. Yes. So when I got to work in ASTT, I got a little bit of the money that to work with that money that we had, and we did a lot. We were paying for almost everything for our people. Now the government, well, that's Quebec, but we don't pay for certain stuff. But when it comes to organize to fight for our rights, we are there. ASTT is there. If we hear the coalition ask us to, since we get to know each other today and we get to know our issues, every issue from different organizations, we all support each other. I think we will be willing to, I am willing to organize my people, of course. And I will talk with ATQ, Agir, in case we need more support. And also we need support from the whole country together. So we're gonna try to get a whole of other organizations within the country to accompany us to fight and combat our rights. So because ASTT is here to stay and the immigration is not stopping, and we need to organize to keep working for them and to keep helping to fight discrimination and discrimination and stigma for all kind of stuff that stick to trans people. We work with the people homeless, we work with people HIV as well. Thank goodness, because we find a doctor for them, for the migrants and for the rest of the population as well. But before they even were allowed to apply to come to this country. So now we have that opportunity to offer them a better life here, and we want to keep fighting for their rights.
So I really like what was said before about the solidarity that has to go both ways and that has to be a bit more present sometimes. And I think that's our solution when things get really bad. It's really important to not stay within just our small communities and our priorities, but it's the moment where we need to reach out and hear what other people are struggling with, because ultimately it's all the same system. It's all the same reasons, and when we're able to take those steps back and see the bigger picture of what's happening to our communities and to other communities, that's, I find, when we're able to actually find ways to organize that can actually lead to something and that are not necessarily obvious. It's really easy when there's a specific policy that's affecting us to mobilize around that, but sometimes there's maybe other things that if we look at it together, we might find something else to do. An example that I really appreciated and that comes up a lot, people talk about this to me a lot, was about, like, I think it was in 2018 at the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, the FFQ, which is the Quebec's feminist movement, which is, you know, full of like this idea of big tent of feminism, which means that let's just have positions that favor the majority and ask everyone else to just be in solidarity and put our needs aside. And it just so happened that the same year there were debates around sex work and around Bill 21 and all of its different iterations. And we were able to get this institution to take positions that made sense on sex work and on Muslim women, because we were able to be in solidarity and make it coherent and say, well, it's the same exact issue. In terms of feminist thinking, it's the same question that we are answering. It's two different topics, but that same hatred is applied to many, many, many people. And if we're able to see those things, then that's when that solidarity can happen. But it's also important to, while we can be in solidarity with people who are affected by something, that doesn't mean that we need to accept and cooperate with people who hate us and people who don't want to recognize us. And when we start to put up those boundaries and start to say, like, no, if this union wants me dead, then I'm not going to show up to their thing, even if it could benefit me in some way, even if I'm in solidarity with their workers, then that's when things also can change within our movement. And then the other thing for organizing that I want to talk about that's just really like tedious and the worst is the fact that we do have to have people who interact within the system. We do have to have people who go and talk to the government in different ways when we all want to say, absolutely not, we're not going to go to the meeting, we're not going to sit at the table. We know some people are doing it. We know there are some instances that keep running even under a conservative government. There's some boards that still have an impact. There's some consultations that still exist. And so a priority, I think, in organizing in the next year is to make sure we map out all those places where people will have some sort of power, even small. Find out who's actually interested in doing this, because there are people who do this, and making sure that they're in touch, that they're accountable, that we're providing them with what we need, and that we prioritize that. Even if the majority of our communities, Stella, I'm the one who has to go do this work sometimes and sit in meetings where I just want to flip the table and strangle everyone. But I have to go and I have to say what our community needs. And it's an honor and a privilege to be delegated to do this, but it's the most violent type of work. So we need to think now, who are we sending? How do they get in? How do we build up people's legitimacy to be representatives of our community? And how do we make sure that the opportunistic people in our community who will go and take those spots when we don't want them anymore, who will go and speak for us, that we don't let them get away with it, because that's what's going to happen also when there's that shift of government. We know that everyone who wants for their own career, for their own, everyone will show up and claim all kinds of stuff, claim that they, worked in whatever community, or that, like, whatever claim that they will have, claim to be speaking for other people. And it's really easy to get away with it when there's no one else there to say no, or no one else willing to take that spot. So that's, I really empathize with the perspective that we just shouldn't, and we should say no and not do this. Sometimes there's a limit, but I think that's a big question that we need to face and think about.
Yeah, so following along what Sandra was saying, definitely, various communities and others have said this evening, various communities coming together, we all do like very specific work, but we share common concerns about our communities, the well-being of our communities, and how governments seek to isolate us and kind of use dog whistle politics. So, I just want to come back to that point I made earlier during the Harper years about the honor crimes and the forced marriage and barbaric cultural practices. By the way, because of Harper, since that time, in the citizenship exam prep book, there's a statement that Canada, we do not tolerate honor crimes. Please know that if you're becoming a citizen. And it's there in the multiple choice citizenship test. So they've kind of put it there and they've planted this sort of notion about honor crimes. But what we were trying to do at that time was point out that we already have legislation about violence against women, for example. We already have laws to protect children. So by sort of trotting out honor crimes and forced marriage, you were kind of practicing a kind of dog whistle politics, low-hanging fruit where people would say, but also pointing out that it's these same conservative politicians and ideologues who push for, against rights to abortion, bodily sovereignty for women, and pointing out that, okay, you might think, okay, those poor brown people and those women have to be protected, but what about you from the majority community? So sort of pointing out that there is a kind of ideological, in this case, kind of misogynistic idea that's there, and it impacts all women. So sort of the commonality. And on that point of all women, one of the things I really, really regret no longer existed, and of course, there are federations, as we know, that bring together all kinds of people and not necessarily all happy campers, but the absence of a cross-Canada women's organization. There was no NAC, and he was just doing everything and there was no voice. And this would be very, very important. I know in the last couple of years there's an attempt that started out of Ontario to have a cross-Canada network of racialized and marginalized women, OCASI. What I heard now, the funding went, and so the person who was heading it up is no longer doing it. But I would like us, for example, to keep that network alive, because we're going to need these networks again. I mean, in Quebec, as Sandra said, we have the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, which is very problematic in many ways, but at least it is there, and we can call on it to speak, and when it speaks, it's known as the Fédération, it's attacked, etc. But it's there, and it's important to have these voices. When Bill 96 was being passed, Quebec women's groups together put out a statement saying, wait a minute, are you going to say if a woman cannot speak French, if she's been here for more than 6 months, she will not get services? If she comes to, say, the South Asian Women's Community Center and she speaks Tamil and no French, we're going to say, oh, sorry, we can't help you anymore. And the women's groups put this out, and it's because of the work that has been happening in Quebec, because of the work of some of us at these tables and other tables, a growing awareness and a building of a common understanding. So this is really important. As I'm sitting here listening to all of us and thinking also of what I should say and be inspirational and hopeful, this is very exhausting. So we need more people. We all need to go out and mobilize a few people and say, please come out of your comfortable spaces and get involved, because these are the things we're going to have to be confronting.
First, I'll touch on something Nakuset said about the AFN, and always there will be, within the same movement, there will be internal struggles and internal disagreements and all that. And we have to live with that. But on a practical level, about how do we get to work with each other, I think the first step is information. The first step is to know about what the other groups, what other problems exist in society, and not only be stuck in your own cause, however just and noble and whatever that is. I was very happy, for example, in some of the encampments by the students for Palestine, to see that they invited sometimes a guest from another cause to speak to the people in the encampment, to know what other people are facing. And I think this practical step, if it's applied in most of our gatherings, that in our groups, to bring somebody from another cause to speak about what they're facing and why and how they see it, that will be the first step in breaking those barriers between the groups and enable some sort of cooperation, some sort of support, at least, if not coordination from the beginning, at least there will be support and understanding for that. On a personal level, for example, when I organize or attend events that are held for the Arabic community, Arabic-speaking community in Montreal, in Arabic, and when I start to introduce something as simple as land acknowledgement, I realize that people are surprised. What are you talking about? I mean, so there are ignorance in different groups, in different communities, is beyond imagination sometimes. And the little bit of information goes a very, very long way. And without that basic information, I think we'll just remain, each of us in our own small silo, and moving forward is going to be very difficult.
Thank you, everybody, for sharing your perspectives on these questions. When we organized this event, the idea was to have 1 hour of hearing from the speakers, and then a bit of a chance to have some questions. Also, I think often it's hard for some people to ask questions, so maybe we'll just take a few questions and then we can hang out a bit. There's really good grilled cheese here. And coffee and whatever. So, we can talk after that. But I'll just say very briefly that there's no perfect political situation, right? All the people on this panel do incredible work. I mean, this is just without question. And thankfully, we live in a city where there are thousands of people doing incredible work on a daily basis, doing community organizing, campaigning. And I agree with a comment that Nakuset shared, which was that when there's a crisis, we do know how to come together. And in this city, there is such an important history of popular mobilization and protest. But often we're responding to crisis points, right? And that's very important, without question. But, this is an experiment, this small event, is to say, what does it look like to try to think proactively about things before they happen, right? And thinking about what we can do to come together in that regard. And I'll just share very briefly that I think that one of the most important things is listening to where other activists and organizers are at, because we're not going to share the same experience, we're not going to share the same politics, but I do think that there is a common sort of interest in organizing together across these different experiences and across these different networks. And that's very challenging, but very important. I just want to shout out Climate Justice Montreal also, who brought their banner. The last ad that Poilievre shared was literally a pro-oil and gas extractionist ad, right? And so, underlining all of these struggles that were mentioned are, two key points, which is that the entire logic of the conservative narrative is based on extracting resources from indigenous lands. So the basic premise of their argument is weak because of the colonial context. And on top of that, their whole narrative, I think, is very feeble. right? And I think building across coalitions is going to be really important to sort of deconstruct that. So we'll just take a chance to open up a bit the space. If people have questions or wanted to share anything, just stand up. And unfortunately, we just have this one speaker. But yeah, if anybody has a question or a comment, welcome. Also, it's fine if you don't. But yeah. Anybody have any thoughts?
I have some thoughts. I don't think they're complete answers, but definitely, Quebec. We live in Quebec, where the mantra is protection of the French language, and under the guise of that, all kinds of neoliberal policies are passed, or you kind of get people on board with something like Bill 21 because there's the Quebec identity at stake. So there's sort of a distraction where getting people to not actually look at the issue of healthcare, education, housing. These are things where not just the CAC government, but previous governments have failed. But this issue of the French language or the other, these are the people. Like just a couple of days ago now, they've talked about the temporary foreign workers. And really, we know this is not an issue, but they make it and sort of create this hype. So what we need to do is sort of get beyond it. Last fall, there were close to 250,000 workers in Quebec, the Common Front, that went on strike. That was amazing. But the thing is not sufficient. And there was a lot of solidarity that went on. People were providing meals to teachers on strike. But it ended, and a lot of connections weren't made, Again, during the time of the student anti-tuition, there were a lot of connections that were made. But how to keep up the momentum, right? That's like a challenge. And really, I don't have an answer. I'm thinking aloud. But if we're talking about Quebec, they sort of get the low-hanging fruit as a distraction, right? With Bill 96, the same thing. The line, they hate Montreal, they hate others, right? So that's what I have to say.
I'm going to say something negative that I hope it becomes positive. I think we were caught off guard with how the CAC started and how it went full-fledged into the many things that you mentioned. And I think that the positive side is that I think everybody is extremely aware. I know about discussions and brainstorming that's going on in many places about how are we going to deal with Pierre Poilievre. Again, when he comes, unfortunately, many people don't see it as if he comes. And that is the strength and the advantage in having this kind of discussion, this kind of exchange is what will lead us, hopefully, to do much better against Pierre Poilievre than we managed to do against the CAC.
One other thing that happens when governments like CAC come into power is that a lot of the bureaucrats that are not elected are very upset about that, and they become allies in certain ways. So it's really important to not discount the power that these people have. One example in Quebec under CAC that somehow we were able to keep moving was the reforms for EVAC, the help for victims of crime. So obviously a government like CAC, they're all about like law and order, and like, so they can't explicitly be against helping victims of crime. So they didn't stop it, but the work was done primarily by various bureaucrats who did reach out to community. I got a call multiple times under CAC by people at the Ministry of Justice in Quebec who were telling me, oh, I'm working on this thing and I see an opportunity. Do you want to hear me out? And having these not secret conversations, but just conversations that are under the political level, but that impact then how the policy is written. And hateful governments have a lot of political will and power and tend to be really competent in like enacting the policies that they want, but they also are focused on certain issues and don't always have time to police everything that's happening. So we were able with EVAC to get some like actually meaningful changes, and we're seeing now, and it's been about 3 years since the law changed and all kinds of policy change, and we're actually seeing in action women in our community that are getting compensated for things that had been refused before, that are, there's a lot of those things. It's not a perfect system by any means, but we were able to do that by talking to bureaucrats, and there's other examples as well. So I think federally the same kind of thing can apply, that there's some people who stay regardless of who the government is, and if it's possible to understand how those systems work, it goes back to just having enough information to know where the power is, and that's how we have to get really granular in our organizing and finding those paths, and having people that are able to do that work of finding within all those systems what is possible. And so an example of what we're doing in HIV right now, sort of in response to many things, but partly to the opacity of government, we're creating a new observatory of HIV surveillance, because we're worried about what's happening to blood samples, what's happening to communication of information between police and public health and between all these institutions. And so we're going to go get that information. We're going to do it through research and through community work, and that's how we will then be able to. And part of that project is to educate ourselves on these issues so we can mobilize. So it goes back to ultimately these systems are really big, but they're not. They're coherent in some way. There are ways decisions are made. There are procedures that do exist, and there are people who have power that we can mobilize and get them to use it. And that's, I guess, the problem that I've encountered, is that progressives in any position of power seem to be very afraid of power, while people who hate everyone are very eager to use it. And so we need to also learn and empower people who are in a position that they have some power, to stop saying that they don't have power and to actually do the things that they can do. So I'm presently, collecting all those contacts over the years of talking to these idiot liberals, all of these people. Like, that's what I'm doing until the next elections. If I'm in Ottawa, I'm going to go have coffee with someone, because these people will still be there when the government changes, and then we might be able to use them.
Anybody else have reflections?
I just wanted to add a little bit something. Yeah, well, in order to find people in high hierarchy, we need to devenir instruit. So as we see the movement, the trans movement is starting to get bigger in the year 2000, and now we are seeing more people working different places. We just not only access to work as coiffeurs or sex worker. Now we see another way of making a living for trans people. So in order for us to keep seeing that evolution for the better, we need to get as Sandra was mentioning, to get people that can accompany us to be more le contraire d'invisible,
Visible?
more visible. So, and that's the only reason why we fight. In order for us, as you see, people are more involved in different fields because we are getting more visible, and so we need governments to give us that opportunity to be more visible in the society. So that's also why we are here, to make sure that we are going forward, moving forward. We are not going back. So that's why that's our support from our project to the rest of you guys.
Well, thank you everybody for coming today. I saw there was a few hands,
There was a
but
hand.
we're not going to take any more questions. We're wrapping this up, but we wanted to leave 25 minutes for people to talk and to meet each other without microphones and without the stage here. So thank you so much to everybody for being here and for your presence and for sharing your thoughts, and to everybody who came, and to Casa del Popolo. I think that we should have a round of applause for the speakers who took their time to be here.